Hello, I'm Roman. Somehow it happened several times during the last week that several people asked me for advice, and it was about how to start programming or how to get sense of the programming. And the reasons were different. One person considers going into tech industry as for the full-time job, and he wants to get a sense of what is the software engineering and what actually the programming is. Second one is a QA person, and he wanted to start using coding for his work, and he wants to do more automation stuff. Third one was actually a recruiter, an HR person, and he wanted to do a little bit of coding to understand better what it's like to be a software engineer. So he wants to get very basic understanding of what it's like to solve problems with the code. And it's interesting how people wants to learn coding not to make it as a full-time job, like for example what I do, but just to have it as one of the skills. And I want to tell from the beginning that this video won't be about how you can quickly jump into tech industry and find your first job. I want here to focus specifically about how you can get a sense of what the programming is, what the coding is, and how it looks like, how it feels like to solve problems with the code. So it will be specifically about doing first steps in programming. And I got these questions from time to time, but it's interesting how it happened during the last week several times, and I just shared 3 examples, but it was more. And for me, like for you, this video will be about getting a plan of actual steps, what you can do to starting from zero knowledge about the coding into implementing something by your own. But for me, it's a chance to think about how I would start learning to code today, because my experience was, I would say, pretty classic. I studied computer science in the university. I finished my university degree around, in the summer, it will be 12 years ago. The way you study the programming and the coding in general back then is, I would say, very different from what you can do today. There were less information available on the internet. There were less free resources of what you can do. And the industry in general was pretty different. And again, this video for you will give you 5 steps of what you can do to start learn programming today. And now let's go. So the first thing you actually need to decide is the programming language that you're going to use. And probably you have no idea how you should select your first programming language. Well, first I have a video about this on my channel that you can watch. But if it still won't help, I would advise you to select between 2 languages. The first one is Python and the second one is Go. And the reasons are simple. Python and Go has wide usage, and especially I would say Python. But again, I'm giving you a choice between 2 programming languages and you still need to decide somehow. So I would tell you this, just search for the code examples of the Python and the Go and pick up whatever you like visually more, because that's what you will be, looking a lot. That's the actual code. And you just can pick up it like visually how it looks like, what you prefer better. Because at this point, probably you have no idea how to properly select a programming language, and right now you need something to start from. Later, once you work with one programming language and you will dive into programming more, you will understand more what you need to do to pick up the proper programming language for a specific task. But right now, just go with something. It actually not that matter. But how we can start? For example, you picked up, Python as your first programming language, and you can just search for free books about the Python, or there are tons of the courses about the Python or even the Golang on the YouTube, like 4 or 5 hours for the basic understanding, and you just, go through these courses, watch them, try to play around with the language, and that's it. Second thing that here you need to decide is the program where you will be writing your code. And I would say For the beginner, there are two main choices. The first one is the community editions of the JetBrains IDE, which is integrated development environment. For example, for the Python, it's, I think, the PyCharm community edition. I'm not sure if it's still available, but it should be. The second one is the VS Code, which is it's not an IDE per se, it's a text editor, but given the fact that it has so many plugins and additions, it's not that far away from being an IDE, and I would say it's actually an IDE already, because it provides you lots of the tools, and you can do like almost everything without leaving this text editor or the PyCharm, for example. The good news that both the VS Code and the, for example, PyCharm Community Edition, they are free, so you can use it, and it should be enough for you to start. Second big topic that you need to go next after you choose your programming language and you play with it a little bit, it's study the computer science foundation. Yeah, I know that some people tell that it's not needed and you shouldn't spend time on this, and I highly disagree. Well, first, because they just wrong, and the second, that yes, you actually facing lots of the stuff from the classic computer science foundation, like in every programming language, in every algorithm. I'm not telling you that to study the complex things, and we'll go a little bit further on the list. You should try to implement and learn some basic things, and while you'll be studying the foundations of the computer science, that will be your first tasks that you can implement. They will be very small, very concrete, and you can find lots of the explanations and the solutions, so you can, learn line by line what you should do, or if you don't understand. So what you should recall? First, you should recall the basic math, like the algebra and the logarithms. Then recall or learn, if it's your first time, the binary system and Boolean algebra. After this, you should learn what is the big O notation, and in general, it's the way to estimate worst case of any algorithm in terms of time and space complexity. And here you will need, for example, understanding of the basic algebra and logarithms. Then you should learn basic data structures like array, linked list, queues, and you should try to implement them. And here you will need an understanding of the big O notation. Here you will need to actually practice to write some code. Those data structures are not that hard to implement, but it might get you some headaches and troubles when you're trying to do it for the first time. And then you will see that those structures that I listed on the screen, you will see them like everywhere. For example, the arrays, I don't know any program that doesn't use the array. After you figure out with the data structures, you need to implement a couple of algorithms. I would say start from some searching algorithms, then you can go for sorting algorithms, and again, I'm not asking you to implement all sorts of the algorithms, just very basic ones. And then just read about what is the recursion, and yeah, in order to understand recursion, you need to understand recursion, but you will get the joke later. After these first two steps, like choosing the programming language and messing around with some computer science foundation, I have three more steps, but I would say that they go like together, and you'll see why. I mean, I will explain why. And the third thing you need to decide is you need to decide what a pet project or what you actually want to implement. Because if your goal to get a sense of what is a software engineering is, then you need to try to implement something. Because on a day-to-day, you'll like most of your time, or like the main goal of you as an engineer will be to build something. And you can try to build something simple on your own. So the first, come up with the idea that sounds interesting to you. Ignore the fact that there are tons of the already existing applications and pet projects like this. Your goal here is to try to build something. It doesn't matter, and it shouldn't be very complex. Maybe you want to implement a financial tracker as a mobile application or at the website, or maybe you want to try to implement some simple, very simple game. The crucial here is that based on the pet project that you will pick up, it will influence what you will need to learn to implement this, because there are lots of the things that you need to be familiar with, and the idea will influence the platform. For example, if you want to implement a mobile application, that most likely will be iOS or Android, or if you want to implement a game, then you will have to deal with the desktop, and that will influence the tools and I would say the system design that you need to learn, and that will be our next step. And the next thing is the actual, I would call it, the system design topics that you need to be familiar with. Again, it goes in parallel with the implementation of the pet project, because based on the pet project and the platform and the restrictions, you'll need to learn some different techniques. You don't have to learn everything all at once. I mean, nobody knows everything all at once. For example, in general, what you could learn or should learn, it will be like the databases, networking, learning some UI, although it will be needed if you will go with the mobile application or the front-end development. Server architecture, again, if you will need to implement a mobile application, you don't have to think about the server architecture at this moment. Caching mechanism, modular design, dependency management, deployment techniques, monitoring, and so on. Deployment techniques will be different based on the, again, idea that you want to build. And the topics that I mentioned before, you can study them already because you will need them anyway, but stick to your pet project first. For example, you're building the financial tracker, and it actually doesn't matter if it's on the mobile or on the server. You will have to understand how you should store the data, and most likely you will have to deal with some sort of a database. Based on the platform, the database itself will be different, but the whole concept of communicating with the database, storing the data, retrieving the data, filtering the data, you'll have to study it. And you can see that as long as you go through the implementation of the pet project, having more questions, the more you will realize what you don't know and what you have to search for. And this approach, you want to implement something, you don't know how to implement something, you can Google it, and then you can watch tutorials, you can find books about this, and your knowledge will start to increase in a very different ways. And the fifth point I want to add here is I would name it as you should learn the best practices of the programming. It's not the same as the system design, although it could sound like something similar. But in the best practices, what you need to learn is, best practices of how you should, for example, structure your code, or how you should organize your work. For example, what I would definitely recommend to study is testing techniques. For example, what's the difference between a unit test or integration test? Then what is the object-oriented programming and functional programming, when it's better to use each one. And here you should study the design patterns. And the design patterns are typical solutions of already existing problems in the software engineering. And it helps you in two ways. First, by studying the design patterns, you will know how to solve a particular software design problem. The second one, it will help other people to understand your code better, because you will follow the design patterns when it's needed, and it will help you to understand somebody's code. There is a classic book about the design patterns, but I would recommend the other resources just because it will be way faster to study the design patterns. You can find some websites that describes each design pattern. You can find videos on the YouTube where somebody implements all of the design patterns in concrete programming language. For example, if you go with Python, just search for Python design patterns and you will find like all of the implementations and the explanations. And this is how I would go and start learning programming today. So first I will come up with a programming language that I would visually like, let's say like this, if I don't understand anything about the programming. Then study some basics of the computer science. It will really help you to move forward. And then you start from selecting a pet project that you want to implement, and in parallel it will define what the system design topics you need to learn and learn the best practices of the coding. All of this creates the 5 steps plan on how you can go from zero understanding of what is the coding and how you can solve a task with the code to actually implementing something that you want to implement. I will put links to some materials that I mentioned during the video and some additional more into the descriptions. Also, I decided to create a second channel where I will post long live coding videos with explanations of what I do, what I want to implement, and how I would implement this. But for now, I see you in the next video. Bye-bye.